New Rangers coach Mike Sullivan has his introductory press conference. How will he handle some of the Rangers' young players? Does he prefer to name a captain? All this and more on today's episode.
You're Locked on the New York Rangers, your daily podcast on the New York Rangers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, Blue Shirts fans, to episode number 1307 of the Locked On New York Rangers podcast. I'm your host, John Chick. Just want to thank you guys, as always, for making Locked On New York Rangers your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. And we are, of course, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So Thursday morning here, and just a short time ago, Mike Sullivan had his introductory press conference as the new head coach of the New York Rangers. MSG was kind enough to broadcast the entire thing. Went about 30 minutes or so. We had a Q&A section with Mike Sullivan, and Chris Drury was there too. They talked to the media for about 20 minutes or so, and then off to the side, Sullivan also did a one-on-one interview with Dave Maloney, so that was good to see. And we're going to have some of his quotes, some of his answers that he gave throughout the entire thing, including both the press conference and the one-on-one with Maloney, just some of the more interesting takeaways from this presser here today. And in some ways, a lot of it was coach speak. You get the certain quotes and the certain things that just about any new head coach in the NHL is going to say upon taking the job. But there were some interesting talking points that come out of this as well. We got some insight into who Sullivan is and what his philosophies are and how he's going to handle business moving forward as the Rangers' new coach. One of the first kind of overarching themes, not just of this press conference, but really of the entirety of the upcoming Mike Sullivan era, is how do you fix the culture here? How do you fix the locker room? Because obviously there were pretty clearly some problems this past season. And these are just the things that we know about. There were a lot of dramatic things that happened with the Rangers last season, and obvious issues that this team had between players and other players and management, players and the coaching staff seemingly. So we were privy to some of that. Some of that, though, I mean, there might have been things going on behind the scenes that we're not even aware of. But that's going to be, whether it was Sullivan or anybody else, the new Ranger coach was going to need to, bring this team back together and make sure that it gets back to being a unit, gets back to being a family that it was as recently as, just last season. So a couple of things that he talked about here in regard to that. First of all, just the idea of the goal being to win a Stanley Cup. And again, it's one of those things to just say it. It's another thing to do it. And I understand that. But you do want a coach who, right off the bat, makes no bones about it. This is the goal for this team. I'm the coach here now, and our goal is to win the Stanley Cup. And Mike Sullivan, for the record, trying to become just the fifth coach in NHL history to win the Stanley Cup with two different teams. This is what he had to say about the whole situation and the ultimate goal of winning a Stanley Cup. The Stanley Cup is anyone's trophy. You got to go out and earn it. This, for me, is what I'm excited about with this group here in New York. As I say to players all the time, nothing is inevitable in this game. You got to go out and earn it every day, and that's what we're going to do. That's what the expectation is going to be. We're going to go out and earn it every day through our actions. That is something that I learned in Pittsburgh the 10 years that I was there. And yeah, again, a lot of this is coach speak, but he mentioned putting together a championship team, putting together a championship operation, putting together a team that ultimately will compete for and win a Stanley Cup. And it is good to hear that, from the new person in charge for sure. I certainly liked hearing that. I'm sure a lot of you did as well. He did decline to comment on what has gone on with the Rangers in recent history, most specifically this past season, because obviously it's a tremendously disappointing season for a million different reasons that we've discussed off and on throughout this podcast. We don't have to get into the specifics today, but you guys know, you watch this team just like I do, and you saw what a disaster piece this entire last season basically was. This is what Sullivan had to say about that. I can't comment on what's evolved here in the past. All I can speak to is what potentially we can build here moving forward. There's a lot of talent in the dressing room, but as we all know, talent alone doesn't win championships. Teams win championships. I think that'll be our challenge from day one, is to become a team in the truest sense of the word. That was the challenge that I think most organizations go through when they enter training camp every year. We're no different in that regard. I've certainly had a lot of experiences over the years trying to meet that challenge, have had some successes, have had some failures along the way, but have learned from all of it. And yeah, that, like I said, is massively important for this team. It just felt like it was a bunch of guys last year. It never really felt like a team. As cliche as that is, something broke in that locker room. And don't take it from me, take it from the franchise goalie. Those were Igor's pretty much exact words at the end of the season last year. I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but he said something along the lines of something broke and we couldn't fix it. And I think, again, whether it was Sullivan or anybody else, whoever took the reins here, whoever became the new head coach of this New York Ranger team, that was going to be basically step one, getting everybody back on the same page, getting everybody pulling in the same direction, and making sure that these guys have each other's backs and that they're going to play for each other every night. That's tremendously important. He was also asked, we're talking about rebuilding the culture here and everything, and making sure that everybody's on the same page. And he was asked about specifically the top players on the Rangers, and he was asked also, I think, to sort of compare it to the top players on the Penguins, the generational players that he had there. It's sometimes during these press conferences is difficult to hear the question of the reporter. I think their microphones aren't turned up that loud, or maybe they're not using microphones at all, but they're typically off screen as they were here, the reporters, that is. But he was asked about, the top players of Pittsburgh and the top players here. And this is what Sullivan had to say. There's a certain burden of responsibility that comes with being a top player on a team. When players embrace that, I think it gives them a chance to be at their very best. I watched that firsthand with some of the guys that I coach in Pittsburgh. No one personifies it more than Sid. And then he went on to say, hope I can have some conversations with some of the top players and core guys here in New York and challenge them in ways that hopefully will inspire them to be at their best. They're very capable guys, elite players in their own right. And I'm really excited about the opportunity to work with them. And yeah, I think when you look at all the Ranger issues this past season, and in some ways, maybe this is a little bit unfair, but most of the blame from the fan base, it wasn't aimed at depth players. It wasn't aimed at random veteran journeymen. It wasn't aimed at young guys that are just getting started in their NHL careers. It was aimed at the veterans. And in a lot of cases, the guys that wear the letters on their sweater. And I don't think that's unfair. When you look at the Ranger depth players from this past season, most of them did their part. You look at like the bottom six forward type players. Most of those guys were giving you an honest effort most nights. It was the top players that seemed to be dragging, that seemed to have effort in certain games and not have effort in other games. And that's just unacceptable. And that's one of the things that you hope that Mike Sullivan is able to fix as far as, the culture of this Rangers team. He also emphasized the importance of playing defense and how you play away from the puck. He actually said something along the lines of that being more important than how you play when you have the puck. And I would agree with that. That's what he had to say about it. One of the conversations that he's talking about his tenure in Pittsburgh at this point. One of the conversations that we had is that talent doesn't win alone. You've got to become a team. You can't score your way to championships. Got to be able to defend and keep it out of your net. And if you're committed and you value those things, then you give yourself a chance. And to put it mildly, and again, I think anybody that watched this Ranger team last year will probably agree with me here. The Rangers were not committed to defense last season. At least not with any sort of consistency. Maybe, certain games here and there, good defensive efforts, but that was few and far between. The Rangers did a horrible job defending the rush. There were too many of those east-west passes that led to a rush the other way. And on one hand, I guess that's not really defense, but in a way it is, because if you make a play like that and it leads to an odd man rush the other way, that is a form of defending. You're giving them a golden opportunity, and you're basically just handing it right to them. So they couldn't defend against the rush. We know that. And they couldn't defend the front of their net. They let guys drive right to the front of their net and or set up shop there. That was all a problem last season. The Rangers just didn't seem to want to fight in the defensive zone the way that you need to fight. The amount of 50-50 pucks they lost that led to goals was unacceptable. Just getting outworked. And that's a big part of defense as well. And certainly that's an area that the Rangers are going to need to improve. You got to figure the Rangers will score some goals. Even in a bad season, we saw decent offensive production from certain players on this team. And then certain ones we didn't, guys like Kreider and Mika, certainly their scoring was down. But overall, I think the biggest issue, offense or defense, I think the Rangers need to fix the defense as much as anything else. He also, Sullivan, mentioned that the Rangers have been close to winning it all in recent seasons. And that's true. For all their issues, for all their problems, and for as miserable as this last season was, we are talking about a team that just last year, the year before the one that just concluded, this team was 2 wins away from the Stanley Cup final. And I know that the roster has changed a little bit since then. Some would argue that maybe in certain cases it's changed for the better. But like I said before, I think the truth lies somewhere between. Are the Rangers going to win the President's Trophy this upcoming season? No, I don't think so, even though they accomplished that just last season. Are the Rangers going to just turn in an atrocious effort every single night and miss the playoffs by a pretty solid margin this upcoming season too. I don't think that's going to happen either. To me, the truth probably lies between the two extremes, and it'll be up to Sullivan to get this team back on track and get them to contendership again. So we'll see if he can pull it off. But in just a second, where I keep everything rolling here, the topic of naming a new Ranger captain did come up, as did a couple of other things. How is Sullivan going to... What's his relationship with Chris Drury going to be like? Will he have some input when it comes to personnel decisions? I found that very interesting as well, and we're going to be discussing all of that and more in just a second. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by Amazon Fire TV. Did you know your Fire TV is also an Xbox? Turn any TV into your gaming and entertainment hub with Fire TV Stick 4K devices. No console required. Just grab your paired controller, subscribe, or sign in to Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with EA Play included, and you are ready to play. Dive into hundreds of premium titles from EA Sports College Football 25 to Call of Duty Black Ops 6 and Avowed as easily as you stream your favorite shows. It's gaming made simple, and it is all on your Fire TV. With 4K streaming, watch more than 1.5 million movies and TV episodes from your favorite subscribed services like Netflix, Prime Video, Disney Plus, Max, and more. Play high-quality Xbox games at a fraction of the cost of a console. Already own a console? A Fire TV Stick 4K device is more affordable and easier to travel with, allowing you to take your games wherever you plug in. Head to Amazon.com/Fire TV Locked On to get started. Xbox Game Pass Ultimate subscription and compatible controller required. Available on select devices, including Fire TV Stick 4K 2nd Gen, Fire TV Stick 4K Max 1st and 2nd Gen, and Fire TV Cube 3rd Gen. And today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is also brought to you by our good friends at Indeed. You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. When it comes to hiring, Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other sites. Indeed's sponsored jobs put your post at the top of the page and help you reach the right candidates faster. We've all been in that spot where we need to hire somebody like yesterday. The pressure is on, and every day without the right person is a setback. That's exactly when Indeed's sponsored jobs come in handy. They make sure your post is seen by the right candidates right now. Now you can speed up your hiring process with a $75 sponsored job credit. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring Indeed is all that you need. All right, let's go and keep everything rolling on Locked On New York Rangers. Big shout out to the everydayers. As always, can't thank you guys enough for sticking with this podcast and all the ups and downs and all the drama with this New York Ranger team. For the everydayers, in our next episode, David Pagnotta mentioned the possibility of Artemi Panarin being traded. It was in a short segment. It's only about 2 or 3 minutes long. He said he's been hearing some whispers on that matter, and we're going to discuss that in the next episode. Now, obviously, Panarin does have the full no-move clause, so no trade can occur without his blessing, but maybe he would do that? Hard to say for sure. Difficult to say for sure, but we're going to discuss that from every angle in the next episode. But for right now, let's keep the focus on Mike Sullivan and the introductory press conference. He was asked if he would have a captain or if he would prefer to have a captain, which is kind of interesting to think about because that's a question that he has never been asked before. Because by the time he took over the Penguins, Sidney Crosby was obviously entrenched as the captain, and he'll be the captain of that team until he hangs up his skates, assuming he doesn't end up playing somewhere else in the twilight of his career. Maybe that's a deep in the offseason kind of an episode right there. But for right now, yeah, I mean, he's always had the same captain there, and he would have never dreamed about making any changes when he was in Pittsburgh. But the bottom line, the Rangers have a vacancy at captain right now. And so this is what he had to say about the idea of having a captain, preferring to have a captain. I think that's a discussion that I'll have with Chris Drury here moving forward. We haven't gotten that far, quite honestly. We'll work through those challenges here over the next little while. As far as the Rangers having a captain this upcoming season, we've all been discussing it off and on this podcast. I'm sure you guys have, talked about it as well, or at least thought about it. I would not be shocked if the Rangers don't end up with a captain this upcoming season. because I don't think there's really an obvious candidate right now. Sure, you could make cases for different guys. I think the names that really come to mind are probably Vincent Trocheck, JT Miller, maybe Adam Fox. I think those are probably your top 3 frontrunners as of now. But the Rangers are in a situation here where they're sort of in the same spot that they were in when Gerard Gallant took over so many years ago. Gallant came in here, and the Rangers hadn't had a captain for a little while. And I think that most of us assume that, okay, well, they're going to name a captain going into this season. It's just time to do that, right? And they didn't do that. They ended up with 6 alternate captains that year. And people had some fun, making some jokes about that. And I'm sure I did too. Some of you maybe did as well. And that's all well and good. But you can still understand why the Rangers chose to go that route when Gallant got here, because Gallant just got here, right? He doesn't really know these players. He hasn't gotten to meet them. He hasn't seen them interact with each other. And it's kind of the same deal here. Now, Mike Sullivan probably has a little bit more familiarity with some of the Ranger players than Gallant did, just from coaching in the Metro for as long as he has. And also, and this was talked about too, the 4 Nations. There were 4 Rangers on the 4 Nations team that was coached by Mike Sullivan, so he got to know some of those guys through that. But again, I would not be stunned if in year 1 with Sullivan, he's got a 5-year deal. You got to figure that he's probably here for the long haul. I mean, not to jinx anything, at the very least, though, you got to figure Sullivan will be given at least 2 years at the helm. He's got a 5-year contract, so we'll see how that goes. But yeah, I would not be stunned if they don't name one. If they do name one, I think you're probably looking at Vincent Trocheck as the front runner. I would put JT Miller at number 2, and I would put probably Adam Fox at number 3. Those are the only 3 that I think really have a shot at it. I can't see it being Mika Zibanejad at this point. I don't think it'll be Chris Kreider. I mean, I know that there's some history between Sullivan and Kreider, but we're not even sure that Kreider is going to be back this upcoming season. And I've said all along, I do think he will end up being traded this offseason. We'll see how it goes. It's not going to be Panarin. Is there anybody else that's even a candidate? I mean, I don't think it would be one of the young guys. Maybe you could make a case for Will Cooley, like being an alternate captain. Cooley might be like I said, a dark horse to be an alternate captain. Can't see them slapping the C on him this early in his Ranger tenure. So I think you're looking at probably a 3-man race: Trocheck, JT Miller, Adam Fox. If they pick one, and that would be my pick too, I think they'll go with Vincent Trocheck. If they don't, then I think you'll see them pick one before the start of next season. But I'm not convinced they're going to name one right here and right now. But Sullivan was also, asked about leadership, and he mentioned that he's spoken to every player on the roster over the last 3 days, or just about every player on the roster. And this is what he had to say about, just leadership in general. The one takeaway that I have from those conversations is I think there's a fair amount of leadership in that room. So whether you wear a letter or you don't wear a letter, leadership manifests itself in so many ways. I think there's a lot of character in that room, just based on the initial conversation that I've had with these guys. Chris and I will work through some of those challenges. And yeah, I think that's important too. Wearing the letter, whether you're doing it or not, I do feel like just about every player in that locker room, or any locker room really, if you have something that needs to be said, stand up and say it. I don't think that it should always fall on the guys wearing the letter. And I don't think the guys that don't wear a letter should feel like they're not allowed to speak up just because of that. So yeah, kind of an interesting dynamic there too, between, the guys that wear the letter and the guys that don't. Again, this does feel like sort of a fractured Ranger locker room, and you're hoping that Sullivan can be that guy that can kind of, bring everything back together here. He was also asked, Sullivan, about, the possibility of him having some input when it comes to personnel moves. And he basically deflected this conversation to Chris Drury, who, like I said, was also in attendance for this presser. But he did mention the importance of having a good relationship between the coach and the general manager. And that's something that we've talked about on here in the past. As much as things went downhill in year 2 with Peter Laviolette, I think that Drury and Laviolette had a better relationship than Drury and Gallant had. Those two, it sounded like, were at each other's throats by the very end. And the writing was on the wall that Gallant wasn't going to be coming back. And I mean, the writing was on the wall for Laviolette too, but it wasn't because of a fractured relationship between Laviolette and Drury, I don't think. It was more just because, did you see the Rangers this past season? They just had to make a change. So, yeah, I think that's important too. You got to have a GM and a coach that are in lockstep. As far as what Drury said about this, he kind of added on to Sullivan's comments. He said, at the end of the day, the lineup card is coach's responsibility. I certainly have no intention of sticking my nose in that. With that said, there's constant communication, constant feedback back and forth. There are no transactions or trades or calls that management does without speaking to the head coach, and that's not going to change here. And Drury also went on to mention that, Sullivan might run some things by him. What do you think about this line combination? What do you think about this power play unit? Stuff like that. And I think that's all well and good. As long as Sullivan, and again, this isn't a Sullivan exclusive thing. This isn't a Ranger exclusive thing either. The head coach should get final say when it comes to, what they're doing with the lineup. Obviously, the GM is responsible for transactions, but it was good to hear from Drury that every move the Rangers make, Sullivan will hear about it beforehand, and hopefully they'll even get his input on it as well. Again, it's very important to have that camaraderie and just make sure everybody's on the same page, because this is a Ranger team. There have been several instances over the last few years where people are not on the same page. I think that much is pretty obvious, but the GM and the coach absolutely must be. Sullivan was also asked about younger players and, how to handle them. Again, it's difficult to hear the questions because the volume is quite a bit lower for the reporters than it is for the coach, but he was basically asked about the younger players. And this is what Sullivan had to say on that matter. What I will tell you is I think it's important that every player earns their opportunities. Now, let me pause for a second right there. On paper, that sounds awesome, right? Everybody gets an equal chance. Salary cap and whatnot, that salary cap hit, that's not going to dictate, who plays where, who gets the most amount of ice time. Everything is fair. Everybody's on a level playing field, and, spot in the lineup, time on the power play, all that good stuff, it's determined by your performance. Seems like common sense stuff, but again, anybody that's watched this team over the past few seasons, which I assume is most of you, that hasn't always been the case. The coaches will say that. They'll say something very similar to what Sullivan just said here. But then what they do, their actions kind of differ from their words, right? We've seen multiple instances of that. Going back to, obviously, Laviolette, going back to Gallant, going back to Quinn. You could probably take that all the way back to AV and maybe even before that. I mean, it's hard to remember everything that happened back then that was that long ago. But that has been an issue. It seems like coaches tend to defer to veterans. They tend to fall back on veterans, and they just don't react to what they're seeing. Sometimes they do. We did see Kreider as a healthy scratch this year. We did see instances where, somebody like Mika Zibanejad, his ice time was reduced. We saw guys dropped off of the top power play unit every once in a while. They didn't do it as often as I would have liked, but we saw it every once in a while. But the bottom line, it's one thing for Sullivan to say this. Let's see it in action for this upcoming season. Opportunities are earned for the old guys, for the young guys, for the guys making 8 figures, for the guys making 6 figures. Everything is earned every single season. I want to see that in action this year, and I assume most of you do as well. But he went on to say, did Sullivan, no one is entitled to an opportunity. I will tell you that as a coaching staff, we will make decisions to help each player be at their very best, and most importantly, help the New York Rangers win. Have a number of experiences with young players in my time with Pittsburgh. We had 5 guys that I coached in Wilkes-Barre that had their names on the Stanley Cup at the end of the year. And he went on to mention Sheary, Rust, Kuhnhackl, Scott Wilson, Matt Murray. And he's correct about that. One guy that he actually did not mention was Jake Gensel. Now, maybe he didn't coach Gensel in the AHL. I mean, I would have to look that up. But there are a decent amount of young players on Pittsburgh who did contribute to, one or both of those championship teams that he had there. So, it's going to be important for him to, keep everybody on a level playing field, but also to trust some of the young guys more than we've seen other Ranger coaches in recent history trust the young guys. That's going to be very important as well. And I think that's music to the ears of a lot of Ranger fans. But again, it's one thing to say it. It's another thing to do it and to actually put these young players in position to succeed, especially if they're showing well in training camp, in the preseason, in practice. If they earn a spot, say like in the top 6, then they earn a spot in the top 6. It should be as simple as that. But we know that it hasn't always been that simple in recent seasons. Going to keep everything rolling in just a second. Sullivan was asked about some specific players in the Rangers, Adam Fox, as well as the other 3 Rangers that he coached at the Four Nations. He was asked about Igor Shesterkin as well. Some interesting quotes there coming out of those portions of the press conference today. Going to go ahead and discuss that in just a second. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA playoffs are in full swing, and every night delivers highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments. Whether it's a game-winning shot or a breakout player, there has never been a better time to get in on the action. FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game before tip-offs and live. With player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays, fans have more ways than ever to play smart and win big. New to FanDuel? It's the perfect time to sign up. Head to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet. If it wins, you will get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, let's go and keep everything rolling here on Locked On New York Rangers. We can close out this Sullivan-centric episode of Locked On New York Rangers by talking about a couple of the comments that he made about some specific players on the Rangers. You do these head coach introductory pressers, and whether it's the Rangers or any other team in any other sport, there's a lot of generalities, right? And that's to be expected because they just got here. They got to basically just introduce themselves and tell us what they're all about. But Sullivan, on a couple of different occasions, was asked about specific players, and one of them was Adam Fox and, coaching him at the Four Nations and the struggles that Adam Fox had there. And he was just asked, was Sullivan, about how he feels about Adam Fox and his game. So Sullivan had to say about Fox, I think he's an elite player. His body of work suggests that. Still a young guy with a Norris Trophy, one of the elite defensemen in the league. Looking forward to the opportunity of working with Adam. Got to know him at the Four Nations. Looking forward to building a relationship with him. No doubt that Adam is an elite player, and we're going to push him to be his very best. And he went on to say, not many who do a better job than Fox quarterbacking a power play than he does up top with the deception he has, his ability to scale the line or run the line, the way he processes the game and thinks the game at such a high level. The prospect of that excites me. And yet this was not Adam Fox's best year. And even with that being the case, he still put up the kind of numbers that the vast majority of NHL defensemen cannot even dream of. Fox, part of it could be the injuries that have piled up over the years. And that's something that we're going to have to keep our eye on going forward because, not this season, but the one before, he had two, pretty significant lower body injuries. And then he was banged up for a spell during his past season as well. You just hope that doesn't, sap his mobility or his ability to do the things that he needs to do on a hockey rink. He's still pretty young. He's just 27 years old. And again, it's not like he had this atrocious season this past year, but you just expect more from Adam Fox. And it looked like at times that he was compromised. And you hope, obviously, that he can get back to being the player that if he doesn't win a Norris, he's at least in the mix. He's at least in the conversation there. Sullivan was also asked about the Four Nations because, again, he obviously was the coach of Team United States, and he had 4 New York Rangers on that roster with him. And they were Chris Kreider, Adam Fox, JT Miller, and Vincent Trocheck. And this is what he had to say about those guys. What I learned about those 4 guys in particular is they are fierce competitors. They want to win in the worst way, and those are the types of guys I get excited about working with. And my reaction to that is, okay, let's see it. Because whether we're talking about just these 4 players or the entire Ranger roster as a whole, effort was a problem this past year. That competitive fire and that competitive drive that Mike Sullivan says that he saw from these guys, I didn't see it on display that often for the Rangers last year. I mean, here and there, sure. But their default setting for a while there was to go out there and skate like they're in quicksand and just go through the motions until somebody tells them it's time to go home. And again, I'm not suggesting it's just these 4 players. It was pretty much the entire team. But again, what we saw last year was borderline disturbing from some of the guys that are supposed to be leaders of this team, and just the overall effort level that was basically non-existent. And look, Sullivan only coached them for 4 games. Maybe the excitement and the energy and the intensity that he speaks of, maybe they were very high during the time that he was coaching them at the Four Nations. But as far as the entire season for the Rangers, no, there were too many games where these guys and the entire rest of the team basically just took the night off, and that's unacceptable. And it is nice to see Sullivan go to bat for these guys right away here. I mean, on one hand, what's he going to say? Like, yeah, I was watching some of the tape from last season, and man, these guys were they were phoning it in, and they just didn't seem like they cared at all, and we got to fix that. He's not going to say anything like that. He's going to put over his guys, especially this early in the game here, and talk about how they're big-time competitors and they want to win and all that good stuff. I mean, you want to build a good relationship with your players, right? So it's good that he gave them credit, and it's good that he kind of built them up going into the season. But now we got to see it. Sullivan has to fix that locker room, and he's got to establish a culture like we were talking about earlier, where effort is no longer optional. It's got to be an every night thing. It's one thing to have 2 or 3 no-shows throughout an 82-game regular season. We've talked about this before. I get it. They're humans. It happens every once in a while. It can't happen nearly as often as we saw it happen this past season with the New York Rangers. And that's going to be one of the biggest things that Sullivan has to fix. And like he was talking about, I mean, it does kind of start with those guys. Those 4 players that he mentions there, Kreider, Kreider, Miller, Fox, and Trocheck, 4 of the veterans on the team, and 4 of the guys that are going to need to lead this team into next season. And 2 of them wear letters, Kreider and Fox. And I think JT Miller and Vincent Trocheck, either one of them could be wearing a letter this upcoming season. So got to get these guys moving. Got to get these guys to put up a consistent effort night in and night out. He was also asked about Igor Shesterkin. This was by John Giannone in the, or no, it wasn't by Giannone. It was by Dave Maloney in the one-on-one interview that followed the press conference. And he was asked about Igor Shesterkin, and he said he's a world-class goalie. When I think about goaltending in the NHL, there might be 3 or 4 guys that bring a consistent level of performance and elite performance year in and year out, and he's one of those guys. When you have that guy between the pipes, I think it breeds so much confidence to the group in front of you. And he also talked about when he was an assistant coach with the Rangers, they obviously had Henrik Lundqvist at that time, and he said it was kind of the same thing. And he mentioned that it's a nice luxury to have, and I would agree. We are very spoiled as Ranger fans to have. I mean, we're looking at like 23 years of elite goaltending basically right in a row. And I know there's going to be some people that say, oh, they spend too much on their goalies. The goalie ends up eating up too much of the salary cap. I get where you're coming from, but right now, when you look at the landscape in the NHL today, and I know Igor is coming off of a down season, at least by his standards. Clearly, he did not have much help. But you give me a Game 7, everything on the line. Got to have a win. I get to pick any goalie in the NHL to start that game in Game 7. I'm going with Igor Shesterkin, and I don't think it's particularly close. You look at Connor Hellebuck, and the Jets did get out of the first round, and he buckled down when he needed to. But I mean, his recent playoff track record, I mean, there's not a chance in hell that I'm going with Connor Hellebuck over Igor Shesterkin in a big time clutch moment in a situation where the lights are brightest. So I definitely agree with Sullivan there. Despite everything that happened with Igor this past year, to me, he is still one of the elite goalies, and he's the best big game goalie on this planet right now. And I don't think anybody will convince me otherwise. We can call it there. If you guys would like to get in touch with this podcast, please send an email to lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Once again, that is lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Definitely give us a follow on Twitter as well, @jchick17. Once again, that's @jchik17. And definitely subscribe to the Locked On New York Rangers YouTube channel. Thanks again, guys. I will see you next time.